A major development in the war on terror. Al-Qaeda's second-in-command has been killed in Pakistan. The U.S. official confirms Abu Yahya al-Libi was killed by a drone strike yesterday. His death is the most serious blow to the terrorist group since the death of its leader Osama bin Laden. Al-Libi's death comes on the third consecutive day of CIA drone strikes in the Pakistani tribal areas bordering Afghanistan. Meantime, Public Safety Minister Vic Taves is warning Canadians about the threat of homegrown terror. Taves announced funding for the study of radicalization in Canada late last week, and he reiterated his concern again today while giving a briefing on Canada's counter-terrorism strategy.
One of the most disconcerting developments for Canadians is actually to see homegrown terrorism, not simply an extremism, but terrorist individuals coming out of communities that have had a home in Canada for a long time, and that Canadian-born individuals would involve themselves in radical politics that lead, in fact, to violence.
So for more on this, I'm joined by Dr. Lorne Dawson from the University of Waterloo, who is working to develop a study of localized terrorism. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Dawson. Tell me about the research that you'll help conduct and how it's going to improve security for Canada and Canadians.
Well, we're trying to launch a network of scholars across the country to try and organize research in this area, because there are a number of individuals doing bits and pieces but scattered across the country. So the first act is we're just developing mechanisms to get everyone together to coordinate our work, to see the ways in which things fit together. So this involves people studying terrorism in general and research on terrorism in general and trying to see how it applies to the Canadian context. But then it also involves individuals coming from the opposite end who work and live in the communities that have been subject to some degree of radicalization, to try and work with them and try and see if there's not better ways in which the government can be cooperating with them to head off this kind of activity.
So is it kind of a virgin area of research then?
It is in some respects. I mean, it's really curious because, of course, 9/11 set off a huge storm of research into terrorism. But that's part of the problem. There's so much information, and it's of a fragmentary nature, and it is so diverse that government officials, even analysts, professionals in the area are pretty much overwhelmed. So you really need scholars to wade into this material and start to sift out what really is worthwhile and significant, start to make connections, draw patterns, and take the next step to get beyond massive amounts of data and description and try and get at some real explanation.
Do you have any insight, however, even already at this stage, on what it is that causes someone to be radicalized, to go from being just a regular religious practitioner to someone who uses that religion to advocate violence?
Well, it's very difficult, but if we're talking especially with the primary concern being homegrown terrorism, and especially in a North American context, you know, one of the most interesting things is that some of the factors that would obviously account for radicalization elsewhere, like having been personally experienced some kind of trauma, some kind of oppression, or having been subject to economic deprivation in some way, those things don't apply. We also now know through the research that there's no obvious psychological profile to people. So we've got to be more fine-tuned to things, questions about identity, questions about young men's efforts to find themselves and to find a meaningful place in society. And it does seem that a lot of the individuals drawn to radicalization in a Canadian context or a US context, it happens at a very fragile moment in their development of their identity, when they might feel excluded, they might feel marginalized in our society, and then they're susceptible to an alternative understanding of how they can achieve some kind of significance.
Do you see any possible parallel with why, say, a young man might choose to join a street gang, a violent street gang, and why someone would choose to go toward radicalization? Do you see some common issues there?
There are very strong parallels, and this is part of the interesting part of the research, because in each case you have to tease out the ways in which there are strong parallels, you know, very significant similarities, but some key differences. So I'll give an example of a key difference. None of the individuals who have become involved in, let's say, jihadi terrorism in a Western context, the vast majority of them don't have a criminal background. They don't have the standard indicators or even sort of preliminary indicators of criminal activity. So what are called crimogenic factors don't seem to apply. Where, of course, in the context of juvenile delinquents becoming involved in gangs, these things do apply. So let's say, for example, youth who join gangs very commonly come from broken families, right? Families with one parent or something of this nature that may be struggling in other regards. That's not a feature of the individuals that become radicalized and seek to wage jihad.
Interesting. And are there perhaps any implications for the non-religious radicalization, say animal rights, environmentalism? Some of that has led to violence, say against a pipeline, for example.
And there's no doubt about it, and that's definitely our concern too. Matter of fact, the Canadian Research Network on Terrorism, Security and Society, which we're launching with this government money, its mandate is not to just look at jihadi terrorism. Its mandate is to look at terrorism in general, and we're concerned about it across the board. So it can be also the environmental kind of terrorism, or it could be right-wing inspired terrorism, some kind of reaction against immigration policies in Canada and things of that nature. Again, the object is to try and note that, you know, in all of these situations, there's some common pattern to how people get drawn to extreme views and how they feel they benefit from holding those extreme views. Then there's even more common patterns how they might be led further into violence. And that doesn't really matter what their ideological orientation is. So we're more interested in those generic social and psychological features. So we hope to learn, let's say, from more detailed study of a group like the Toronto 18, things that would be just as useful for potentially some future group that may be moved by another political issue.
Dr. Dawson, thank you.
Thank you very much.